In this video, we're going to learn what a chain is and what speed spells are. Chains are used in order to help resolve a sequence of activated card effects. Whenever a card is activated, it starts a chain link. If a card is responded to, it creates the next chain link. Whenever a player activates a card, it will start a chain link, and then priority is passed to the opposing player, who can then respond with a card of their own. If they do not choose to respond, you can respond to your own card. Both players are given the option to respond to each other's card effects until neither player would like to activate any additional card effects, and then the chain is resolved backwards. Let's take a look at a diagram to see how this works. The first player to activate a card will create Chain Link 1. Chain Link 1 can be made with a card that has a speed spell of 1, 2, or 3, even though this diagram does not mention that a chain can start with Chain Link 3. It is possible. Assuming the turn player activated Chain Link 1, the non-turn player is allowed to respond at Chain Link 2. Depending on the speed spell of whatever Chain Link 1 was, they are allowed to respond to Chain Link 2 with an appropriate speed spell. We'll learn about speed spell after we finish going through this chain. So if Chain Link 1 was started by the turn player, Chain Link 2 can be started by the non-turn player. If the non-turn player chooses not to activate a card or effect, the turn player can then activate a card in response to their own card and be the starter of Chain Link 2. Whoever activates Chain Link 2 passes priority to the other player, who can then choose to activate a card at Chain Link 3. If they choose not to, the player who activated Chain Link 2 can respond, and this will continue so on and so forth forever, until one of two things happens. Both players choose not to activate any cards or effects in response to the previous card on the chain link, or the cards or the effects that they have remaining that they can activate are not cards that can be chained to the other cards because of their speed spell. At this point, we have now completed our chain, and we need to go over how to resolve the chain. A chain resolves in the opposite order in which the cards in the chain were activated. So Chain Link 4 will resolve first, followed by Chain Link 3, followed by Chain Link 2, followed by Chain Link 1. So as we've seen previously in this series, this is the Fastfx timing chart. If a chain is built, we've gone through box D, chain rules, and when a chain resolves, we return to the yellow box, which might allow us to start a new chain, before eventually returning to the open game state. From every open game state, there are 3 possible actions a player can take. They can not start a chain, which will eventually lead into chain rules. They can start a chain by activating the first card in the chain, which will lead to chain rules. Or they can pass priority, which may eventually lead to their opponent activating a card and starting chain rules. So chain rules are very important to understand how the game will function. So now it's time to talk about speed spell. Every activated effect has a speed spell. A card can have a speed spell that is either 1, 2, or 3. Card effects that are speed spell 1 must start a chain. They cannot be activated in response to cards. They cannot be activated in response to other cards, with the one exception that you have multiple trigger effects that activate simultaneously. We'll talk about that as a separate scenario towards the end of the video. Card effects that are speed spell 1 will generally only be activated during your main phase 1 during the open game state, unless it is a trigger effect whose trigger condition is met at some other time. Cards that are speed spell 1 will normally be normal spells, equipment spells, continuous spells, field spells, ritual spells, effect monsters who have ignition effects, trigger effects, or flip effects. Some continuous spells that are already face up on the field have their own ignition effects, or trigger effects as well. Those would also be speed spell 1. There are occasionally a continuous trap card that may have an ignition effect, would also be speed spell 1. The effects of spell cards that activate in the graveyard are speed spell 1. They're either trigger effects or ignition effects. Cards that are speed spell 2 are trap cards, normal or continuous, quick play spell cards, or effect monsters that have quick effects. Speed spell 2 cards can be activated in response to speed spell 1 cards or speed spell 2 cards, and are usually the bulk of cards on a chain. Speed spell 3 cards are counter traps. Counter traps can only be Speed spell 3 cards can be activated in response to cards that are speed spell 1, 2, or 3, but the only card that can be activated in response to a speed spell 3 card is another speed spell 3 card. In other words, you can only activate a counter trap in response to a counter trap. For a chain, where player 1 activates Heavy Storm as Chain Link 1, player 2 responds with Threatening Roar as Chain Link 2, and then player 1 negates Threatening Roar using 7 Tools of the Bandit as Chain Link 3. Let's take a look at this with a more visual representation. Player 1 has Heavy Storm in their hand and 7 Tools of the Bandit set on the field. Player 2 has Threatening Roar, Jar of Greed set on their field. Player 1 activates Heavy Storm, which is a speed spell 1 normal spell card. Its effect is to destroy all spell and trap cards on the field. The opposing player has Threatening Roar and Jar of Greed on their field, so they're going to have 2 cards destroyed by Heavy Storm. But because the turn player has just activated Heavy Storm as Chain Link 1, priority is passed to the opposing player, who can then respond with a card that is speed spell 2 or speed spell 3. Both Threatening Roar and Jar of Greed are speed spell 2 and can be activated in response to Heavy Storm. And because their cards are going to be destroyed anyway, they feel a need to activate these cards. So in response to Heavy Storm, player 2 activates Threatening Roar. Its effect is your opponent cannot declare attacks this turn. Player 2 would still like to activate Jar of Greed because it's going to be destroyed anyway. The effect of Jar of Greed says draw 1 card. But because they activated Threatening Roar as Chain Link 2, player 1 is now allowed to activate a card in response to Threatening Roar. They activate their set 7 Tools of the Bandit. 7 Tools of the Bandit says when a trap card is activated, pay 1,000 life points, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. So, Jar of Greed can now not be activated, even though priority has been passed back to the player B. They are not allowed to activate a card in response to 7 Tools of the Bandit, because the card that they have left that remains to be activated is Speed Spell 2. And Speed Spell 2 cards cannot be activated in response to cards that are Speed Spell 3. So we'll resolve the chain backwards. 7 Tools of the Bandit will negate the activation of Threatening Roar and destroy it. Threatening Roar will resolve without effect. It's considered to have never been activated because its activation is negated. Heavy Storm will then resolve, destroying the remaining Jar of Greed on the field, because Threatening Roar would have already been destroyed and already sent to the graveyard, because when a card is destroyed, it is already sent to the graveyard. So Heavy Storm will destroy the Jar of Greed. Jar of Greed will not allow to be activated in response, and because Threatening Roar was negated, player A will still be able to attack with cards this turn. Earlier on in this video, I mentioned that there is a scenario in which Speed Spell 1 cards could be chained to other Speed Spell 1 cards, and it was when multiple trigger effects met their conditions simultaneously. This is in a separate section in the rulebook on Other Rules. The section we're going to be looking at is when multiple cards are activated simultaneously. It says if effects of Speed Spell 1 cards, like trigger effects, are activated at the same time, they will be resolved in a special chain, meaning they don't activate in response to other cards, they start a new chain. For example, player A controls B Buster Drake and Sangan. Player B controls El Shaddoll Construct and Shaddoll Dragon, and one of the players activates the spell card Dark Hole. For this example, we will say that player A activates Dark Hole, making them the turn player. This is because Dark Hole, as Speed Spell 1, is not a quick effect and cannot be activated on your opponent's turn, so it could not be activated by player B at any point in time. The only Speed Spell 1 effects that should be activating at any point other than your own main phase is trigger effects, whose effects activate when something happens, such as being destroyed by a card, which is what's going to be happening here. So in this scenario, the turn player performed an action that started a chain. They activated Dark Hole. It preceded the chain rules. Neither player had any response to Dark Hole, so Dark Hole then resolves. And then we proceed to the yellow box after the chain resolves to see if any trigger effects had met their condition. In this case, 4 trigger effects have met their condition. All 4 of the monsters destroyed by Dark Hole have an effect that activate when they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect. Sangan says if this card would be sent to the graveyard, it does something. B Buster Drake says if it's sent to the graveyard, it does something. El Shaddoll Construct says if it's sent to the graveyard, it does something. And Shaddoll Dragon says if it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect specifically, it does something. But in this specific scenario, Dark Hole is a card effect, so Shaddoll Dragon also meets its trigger condition. All 4 cards are going to be able to activate because their trigger conditions were met. Even though they're all Speed Spell 1, they can all be activated in response to one another, following a very specific set of rules that are listed here in the rulebook. We often refer to this set of rules as SEGOC, or Simultaneous Effects Go On Chain. So the rules of SEGOC are that the first cards that are placed onto the chain are the mandatory trigger effects of the turn player, followed by the mandatory trigger effects of the non-turn player, followed by the non-mandatory effects of the turn player, followed by the non-mandatory effects of the non-turn player. So in this case, the only mandatory effect to be activated is Sangan. So player A will place Sangan onto the chain as Chainlink 1. Now, if player B had any mandatory effects to activate, they would go onto the chain as Chainlink 2, and so on, depending on how many they had. If they had multiple mandatory effects, they would put them all onto the chain, but they can put them in any order they'd like. But in this case, there is only one mandatory effect, and because it's for turn player to player A, they have to activate Sangan as Chainlink 1. After we place mandatory effects onto the chain, we activate non-mandatory effects. So in this case, all 3 of the remaining cards are non-mandatory, and the way they go onto the chain is that the turn players have to be activated first. So because B Buster Drake is a non-mandatory effect, the turn player has the option to activate it. If they would like to put B Buster Drake on the chain, it would go here as Chainlink 2. They do have the option not to activate it at all if they choose not to do so. It's also only illegal to activate this card if there is a Union monster in their deck, as its effect is to search for a Union monster. If there are no Union monsters in their deck, it is not legal to activate. Sangan has an effect to search for a 1500 attack power monster or lower from their deck to the hand, but because its effect is mandatory, it must go on the chain. There is no choosing not to activate a mandatory effect, even if the card cannot be resolved. The next effect that would go onto the chain is either El Shaddoll Construct or Shaddoll Dragon in either order. So the optional effects of the non-turn player can go onto the chain in either order that they would like. So in this case, they're going to put Shaddoll Construct as Chainlink 1 and Shaddoll Dragon as Chainlink 2. If they wanted, they can do Shaddoll Dragon as Chainlink 3 and El Shaddoll Construct as Chainlink 4. Because their effects were optional, they both have equal priority on the chain link, and they can put them on the chain in any order, and strategy in the game will dictate whether or not you'd like to activate either of these effects in either particular order. Let's take a look at one more example where multiple trigger effects meet their activation conditions simultaneously, where strategy is part of the decision-making in how we want to structure our chain link. We are playing Salamangrate, a deck that all monsters contain the word Salamangrate, and we normal summon our monster Salamangrate Spinny. We then declare that we are going to perform a link summon, and we perform the link summon of Salamangrate Balinx, who has an effect that says if this card is link summoned, you can add 1 Salamangrate Sanctuary from your deck to your hand. Now, because we sent our Spinny to the graveyard in order to perform the link summon of our Salamangrate Balinx, we have also met the trigger condition of our Salamangrate Gazelle in our hand, which says if a Salamangrate monster is sent to your graveyard, except the Salamangrate Gazelle, or during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. So Salamangrate Balinx met its condition to add a field spell, Salamangrate Sanctuary, to our hand. and Salamangreat Gazelle met its trigger condition to summon itself because the Spinny was sent to the graveyard when we performed the link summon of the Balinks. So we can activate these in either order. We can either activate Balinks as Chainlink 1 and Gazelle as Chainlink 2. The chain will resolve backwards, Gazelle will be summoned, and Balinks will add the field spell. Or we can activate Gazelle as Chainlink 1 and Balinks as Chainlink 2, so we add the field spell and then summon Gazelle. Now, some players like to do this in order to prevent their opponent from responding to the last thing in the chain. So if they wanted to avoid being ashed, which is a card that prevents a card from adding a card from deck to hand, they might put Balinks as Chainlink 1 so that its search for the field spell cannot be responded to by an Ash Blossom. In the next video, we'll talk about any remaining details I may have left out while going through the entire rulebook. We've effectively gone through the entire rulebook with the exception of a couple of miscellaneous things I either missed or are part of the other rules or glossary section.